Thank you for being here. Today we're going to cover geoeconomics, which is largely work with my co-authors, Chris and Jesse. And so we're going to just jump into it. It's a topic that has attracted an enormous amount of attention over the last 5 years, but probably especially in the last 2. And it used to be something that economists didn't really pay a lot of attention to, and now there's a lot of research, so I'm kind of hopeful that for all of you this will become something exciting to do work in. What is the definition? At least the definition that I'm going to use is going to be that hegemonic countries like the US and China use the existing trade and finance relationships that come from their economies to exert power abroad. And they might be exerting power for geopolitical reasons, for economic reasons. They might be bullying a government or a private firm. We're going to sort of figure it out. There's just some set of interesting questions in this area that I think I want you to have in mind. One is, first, is this a thing? Like, in what sense is this powerful? Where does it come from? If you have it, how are you going to wield it? What does optimal policy, if you're a country like the US or China, look like? Of course, we're immediately interested in welfare, particularly in the welfare consequences for the rest of the world. So you can imagine that a lot of the colloquial version of this topic has a zero-sum logic. It's the logic of essentially mercantilism. There is a fixed set of resources, and we're going to bargain over these resources. But as an economist, we've long ago dispelled this notion that that's how the world economy works. We think that the pie might be increasing or shrinking as we exert power, and that everybody could potentially be better off or worse off. So we're going to think about that. And then we're going to go a little deeper. We're going to start thinking about, okay, what is national security? What is a national security externality? How do you measure it? And in particular, is there a trade-off between the gains from trade, the arguments that you're all familiar with that come from specializations, that come from external economies of scale, versus economic dependency? Okay? And if there is that trade-off, then how does optimal policy shape it? And of course, we're interested in measurement. Can we do policy counterfactuals? If the US will be cut off by rare earths, how much of the US economy will go down and which sectors are going to suffer? Is this going to cause a garden variety recession, no recession at all? Is this going to cause like a massive recession? Like those quantity questions are clearly sort of interesting. Okay, so the way I'm going to structure the lecture for today is I'm going to give you a bit of a background of the topic, also away from economics, in particular in political science. Mostly because I suspect that all of you as PhD students have no idea about that. And to be honest, neither did I. Like I had to go and learn it. And it's useful. Then we're going to go deep into theory, and then we're going to do empirics in the second half. And we're going to do 2 different types of empirics. We're going to do something that is much more familiar to all of you, particularly those that have taken a trade class, which is sufficient statistics approach. So mixing a model with the hard data, trying to get some quantitative answers. And then we're going to look at something quite different potentially, which is looking at unstructured text as a way to figure out who's exerting pressure on whom. Okay, good. So let me start with the broader conceptual questions. One complaint that I've had for a while that got me interested in this topic is that if you think about the modern econ version of power, we kind of reduce everything to mean market power, the ability to sell a good at a markup. And a lot of the basic classes that you've taken in IO, for example, or in macro have that notion of market power. But when we say that a country is powerful, or that even a company like JP Morgan or Google might be powerful, we generally have in mind something broader than just the ability to sell at a markup. And so there are some interesting concepts of power that come from political science that are worth highlighting. The one that I'm going to use the most is the very top one, comes from Robert Dahl in 1957, and says, look, A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that he would otherwise not want to do. Okay, you can see that a markup is one such thing that the guy wouldn't like to pay up, but potentially is very general. Is what the political scientists call relational power. Why? Because they're thinking it's affecting the relationship between A and B, but it's taking the entire environment as given. Okay? Susan Strange, she had a different notion called structural power, which is essentially the ability from a player to affect an entire environment. She had in mind, for example, setting up the rules of the game or setting up some norms. Today I'm going to give you our own rendition of this, which has much more with influencing general equilibrium variables. So being large in that sense, okay? The political scientists themselves complain that this is a topic that within their field has remained very informal and chit-chatty, and therefore the people don't know exactly what they mean. So part of what I'm going to try to do today is to give you at least our own rendition or take on this to make it precise enough that you can do theory and bring it to the data, okay? But I strongly suggest reading some of these things. In particular, I would suggest reading this book, which I did not put on the syllabus, but I would strongly suggest you read. It's a fun book, and it's also quite readable. Well, fun, it's a strong word. It's a book on a particular topic, which is Nazi Germany influencing the rest of Europe in the lead up to World War II, and using his economy to exert that influence. So Hirschman is an interesting character because first he has a Netflix show. It's called The Transatlantic, it's very good. But he's famous for many different reasons. Most economists know his later work in political science. That's great. Some economists know the work in the middle of his career, that is essentially the work that set up the input-output matrices and the backward and forward linkages. Like the work that, for example, Bakayi and Fari have been doing picks up on that. This is earlier than that. This is him as a young economist. He goes to Berkeley, he's trying to get a job as a faculty member at Berkeley, and writes this as essentially a trade book. And it's interesting because he has in mind two things. First, he had a very obvious distaste for mercantilism. The idea that we're simply bargaining over fixed resources. But at the same time, he was pretty dismissive of the English free traders, of the idea that if we simply had free trade, this will never generate any imbalances because everything will be evenly distributed with many partners. So he had in mind a view where trade leads to imbalances, and those imbalances lead to power imbalances. And it's a pretty interesting book, and I strongly suggest reading it. Now, what's interesting is that as part of the book, he derived an index that you all know, which is the Herfindahl index. Part of my complaint that everything has been reduced to market power is that you've all learned that index in the context of measuring concentration of firms for markups. But the original index was created to measure concentration of trading partners compared to another sovereign, and therefore power imbalances in trade. But it has totally lost that connotation. Now, if you go and pull out the citations of that book, you can see that it used to be a big deal in economics, then not so much. In the middle, a field opened up in political science called international political economy that has really focused a lot on these issues. So in the next slide, I will have some citations of, well, the papers that I wrote and I'm asking you to read for the class, but also at the end, a long reading list of papers that are away from economics, that if you're interested in this topic, I strongly suggest reading. There is just a lot of good, deep thinking in political science about these issues that economists tend not to be exposed to. And if you're a young PhD student, there might be lots of papers hidden in there as those ideas spark some interest. Okay, so I strongly suggest picking them up. Okay, so for the purpose of what I'm going to do for the modeling side, part of what I think we did the last few years has been building models or frameworks to understand these questions out of basic tools of economic theory. You will see that I'm going to highlight three, two of which are very familiar to you. Well, all of them are familiar to you, but some of them you're more familiar with than others. The first is going to be very straightforward. I'm going to define power as essentially a gap between the inside option and the outside options. And the participation constraints of the people you target is going to be a very nice way to keep track of these notions of power. Okay, so we're going to use that all over the place. The second tool, which is probably a little less familiar to you, has been to think of costly actions, think of exerting power as, in the Dahl definition, as asking somebody to do something that they wouldn't want to do. We're going to make that formal by saying, I'm asking you to put wedges in your first order conditions. They're deviations from what you would have privately, optimally wanted to do. The reason why they're so powerful is that 30 years of macro theory and public finance theory has figured out how to solve lots of optimal policy problems in that context. Okay, so we're going to review those. Finally, we're going to try to give an incarnation of the structural power, or the idea that part of what makes me powerful is that I can manipulate an entire equilibrium in my favor. We're going to think of it as manipulating externalities in general equilibrium. We're going to say that there are some equilibrium objects that I take derivatives over when I take my optimal policy actions that the agents take as given. And that's going to give us a nice theoretical distinction between relational stuff, which I'm going to call micro, and the macro stuff. Okay? So these are the papers that I've asked you to read. But, and they're all with Chris and Jesse. And for us, this is a great area. We're doing lots of work. I hope you get involved. But even more important to you is if you click on that button on the reading list, there's a long reading list in both economics and political science, both of current work that other people are doing in this area. Steve Redding, for example, here with Benny are working also on this, and they have great papers. But even more relevant in terms of hard to access for you, there's a lot of reading in other fields that I suggest you do in general as an economist, but certainly particularly if you're going to get involved in this. Okay, so let's fix ideas. Okay, we're going to fix ideas and then we're going to go formal. So to fix ideas, start with an example, okay, which we're going to carry throughout. Think of having ASML. So this is the Dutch lithography firm. Okay, they produce advanced machines for semiconductors. They have US suppliers and they have Chinese customers. And if you think of them as a private enterprise, think of Z as a vector of all the aggregates, all of the state variables. Prices, aggregate demand, the state of technology, all of the typical stuff. X star is the firm optimal decisions of input-output. So who to source from, how much, who to sell to, how much, if it's undisturbed. Okay? So it's essentially what comes out of first order conditions. Okay, now think of the US government. It wants to affect this firm. What it wants is for the firm not to sell these machines to China. Okay? Let's forget for a second whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. That's what they're trying to achieve. Well, the way we're going to think of it is we're going to think that it wants to put a wedge on a particular dimension of the actions of ASML that makes it more expensive. It makes ASML perceive that it's more expensive to sell these machines to China. Or you can think of it as a quantity restriction. It might simply want to dictate that you can sell at most X machines, okay, where X might be 0. The fundamental issue is that ASML is not a domestic firm of the US. So the typical recourse that you have over domestic firms, you can dictate export controls, you can regulate them, you can tax them. You don't have them. This is a Dutch firm. So you have to induce them to take the action. What can you do? Well, you can do the usual things. First, you can provide positive inducement. You can pay. You can say, look, if you do what I say, I'm just going to give you money. Or you can provide negative inducements. You can say, do what I say or else. Something bad might happen to you. In this particular case, the US went for the negative inducement. They threatened ASML that if they were not to comply with the US demands, they would invoke potentially or allegedly the foreign direct product rule. This is a rule that essentially tells ASML that if they don't comply, they're going to be added to the entity list, which is the list of companies or entities that no US person can do business with. So that essentially is a death sentence for ASML. Right? You cannot have any relationship with any US person. That's not going to work. So if you think of it formally, what are you doing? The threat, which we had with a theta in red, it's moving the value function of the firm way to the left if the threat is very powerful. It's telling you that potentially it can do something to you that while you're going to be able to react to it and re-optimize, might make the value of the firm a lot lower. So the participation constraint then becomes very natural. ASML is comparing what they can do at the outside option once they lose access to doing business with the US, compared to at the inside option, not having the threat, so dealing with a full set of US persons, but acquiescing to the demand of the US, taking on the costly action. That's it. I mean, this is loosey-goosey for now. We're going to make it very formal in a second. But a lot of the intuition of this work comes out of keeping track of these objects. You can immediately see that now it's all going to be about how do you shift the inside option, how do you shift the outside option. When you're collectively bargaining with many people, how is that shifting the Zs, the aggregates, that all of the firms take as given, but that you might be able to manipulate. Okay, so a lot of it is going to show up there. And just to warm up, here are simple definitions. If you think of relational power, like purely micro, think of the firm. The firm is taking as given the equilibrium aggregates, and is simply checking what is the maximum cost of private actions is willing to comply with before it's better off at the outside option. So we're going to define micropower to be precisely that concept. Now you can see that later when we go to the data, things like the elasticity of substitutions, if I'm threatening you with not selling you something, how easily can you find an alternative? Can you source it somewhere else? If I'm threatening with withdrawing technology, can you create the technology yourself? All of those objects are going to tell us by how much am I able to move the inside and the outside options. So a strategic sector in this sense is going to be one that makes you form very valuable threats. So let's make a simple example. Okay? Consider oil. Okay? Oil, one variety of oil, isn't strategic. Why? Because if I tell you that I'm not going to sell you this very particular variety of oil, many other types of oil are from other countries, are pretty close substitutes. If I'm OPEC, particularly in the old days, and I control the entire supply, then oil might be very strategic because now the outside option is using something very inferior to oil. Okay? But you can see immediately in this concept that you can go to the other one, to macro power. In macro power, the hegemon is exploiting precisely that gap, is exploiting that when it bargains with individual entities, they're tracking their own private costs. But the benefits to the hegemon are going to accrue from changing the environment, from the fact that as I tell multiple people not to do something, I might be affecting the aggregate. So let's do a simple example. Suppose that I want to have a very powerful social media. Okay? Social media has a strategic complementarity. You want to be on it because everybody else is on it. So what am I going to do? I'm going to tell each one of you that what I want you to do is to be on my social media and to close your other accounts on the competing social media. Why do I care about that? Because each one of you is going to take the equilibrium as given and is going to compute the private cost of shutting down the other social media and focus on mine. But as you do that, you're making my social media very attractive for everybody else and the outside options very unattractive. So once I have you all hooked up on my social media, threatening to kick out any one of you individually, it's very, very powerful. Because now your outside option is a social media that nobody else uses, while the inside option is the one that I control and everybody's on it. So all I'm doing is a drug dealer model. I'm sort of getting you to coordinate on an addiction and make the outside option very, very bad. That's a simple example of this one. In this sense, strategic sectors are those that allow the hegemon to manipulate the economy in its favor. You will see later when we do optimal policy that this also means that in this class of models, the presumption for government intervention is much lower than, say, in macro-pro policy, in financial regulation. In financial regulation, the problem is that we're all trading, and we don't have internalized that we're all employing the same strategies, and that because there are some prices in constraints, we're going to have fire sales. But it's a coordination problem. Here is very different. You're playing against a big player who's twisting the equilibrium in their favor. So the probability that you as a government, if you internalize more of the game, you wouldn't want to intervene, it's pretty low. Okay, so it's just, here's another good example. Think about the western seaboard of the US. Each part that accepts a contract from China might take the value of national security as given and say, look, China is providing this bid, that's good or bad for me. But as China controls the entire western seaboard of the US and Latin America, you might think that that affects the national security of the country. But each of the private agents isn't taking this into account. And therefore, the probability that you might want to have government screening for strategic sectors is pretty high. Okay, so the intellectual backing for it comes from a very different nature than a simple fire sale externality that you're familiar with in finance or macro. Good. So we're going to start the model, and we're going to do it formally. Okay, and part of what I want to do is focus on the specifics of this topic, but it's also going to allow me to cover some tools, in particular the primal approach to solve optimal policy, that are of interest to you much more generically than the specific problems. Okay, so let's start. We have n countries, okay, and there's a set of productive sectors and a set of local factors. So a sector here, it's an activity in one country. Think of Russian oil and US oil are two different sectors that might very well be highly substitutable in their output when they're as inputs in other sectors, but an activity taking in one place is a sector, okay? The sectors have a unit mass of firms. They're pretty straightforward. What do? They're buying intermediate inputs from other sectors. They're using local factors. And the only thing that is different is that I'm going to stick in their production function a set of aggregates. So this is a trick that has been used a lot from Greenwald-Stiglitz on how to capture externalities very simply. It's just to think of a sector of aggregates that potentially affect the production function of the consumer. Simple examples, okay? Suppose that you wanted an external economy of scale. Then Z is the aggregate output of that sector. The bigger the aggregate output, the more each of the firms is productive. If you want a strategic complementarity, Z might be the sector usage across sectors of an input. The more other sectors are using this input, the more that input is productive for me. If everybody else is on this payment system, me being on the same payment system is productive. Okay, so it's going to be very simple to play around. And then they're going to have a representative consumer and government. The representative consumer is very straightforward. So the part that I'm going to focus on, it's simply utility over consumption. But I'm going to allow to capture some ulterior motives for geopolitics as saying that he also has a direct utility over some aggregates. Just to make it simple, suppose that I truly don't like another country military sector being big. Okay, I'm going to plug it in there. Or I truly don't like, I care about the difference between your output and mine. Okay, like a habit. I'm not going to play much with it because, well, we have no reason, we have no foundations, and so it's totally arbitrary. You probably are familiar with those things, for example, in climate change, where pollution might make the consumer unhappy. It's fine. I think what's useful in this setup is to see, given the objective function, how it translates into the policy game, but the objective function is totally made up, so I'm largely not going to use it and focus on consumption. Okay, the budget constraint is very straightforward. They have factor income. The factors are only used domestically. They have the profits of the firms, and that has to finance the consumption plan. So what did I sneak in? I sneaked in an assumption that each consumer owns a domestic firms. There is nothing difficult in this set of papers allowing cross-border ownership. You can think of multiplying the matrix of profits by an exogenous ownership matrix. What's difficult and interesting is to solve for endogenous ownership. And I will give you a sense when we solve the equilibrium of why you might want to have a shopping list for FDI. You might want to go abroad and buy stuff. But here for now, I'm not going to allow it. That gives me wealth. That's essentially the right-hand side of the constraint. Given wealth and prices, the first order condition will define a Marshallian demand and indirect utility. And that's going to be my objective function if I'm the government. Okay? And then markets have to clear. So anything that gets produced get either used as an intermediate input somewhere else or gets absorbed by the consumer. Okay, and the factors have to clear. That's it. Okay, so think of it as we set up a large input-output matrix globally, and there is reasons to trade with each other, and there's a very simple consumer problem. Where it's interesting is the policy game. So everything we just described happens at the end. In the middle, I'm going to have the offense. So that was part of our first paper. It's a theory of, if I'm a hegemon, what do I do? Where does my power come from and how I exert it? I'm going to make a country the hegemon exogenously. I'm not going to think about why is it the US. I'm just going to say this country is a hegemon. Now, what defines it being a hegemon is the ability to do the following in this paper, is to threaten foreign entities that if they don't comply with what the hegemon wants, they're going to lose access to a set of input that the hegemon controls. So for the purpose of today, I'm going to focus on threats not to sell you stuff. Okay? Then we can think about threats not to buy from you, other positive inducements, but for now, let's focus on the threat being, I don't sell you stuff. I don't sell you semiconductors. I don't sell you rare earths or oil. As we discussed, what I'm going to ask you to do is to put a set of wedges in your first order conditions and potentially to give me transfers. Okay, the wedges, I'm going to make them revenue neutral. What does it actually mean? It means that I rebate them to you, but each agent doesn't perceive the rebate as fixed. Basically, they work like quantity restrictions. In fact, formally, we're going to use the primal approach, which means I'm just going to directly dictate the quantities. Okay, but we're going to implement them with wedges. Okay, and you will see it in a second. And the rest of the world is going to simply accept or reject. Okay, so all of the bargaining power is with the hegemon who makes a take it or leave it offer. So the theory of the offense is going to be, what do I do with these things? What do I ask you, why, and how do I maximize my power? Good. So that's one paper. Then we're going to go down here and we're going to say, okay, ahead of time, at the beginning, every country is going to have a full set of wedges that they can apply on their domestic firms. And for simplicity, we're going to have no participation constraints. We're going to assume that domestically, you're entirely dictatorial. You can do whatever you want. Okay? The difference is that in the middle, the hegemon is bullying foreign firms, foreign entities, with whom it might have an economic activity. Here, you're doing domestic policy. So those wedges are going to be the typical things that you're familiar with. Industrial policy, export controls, trade policy, like tariffs, things that you do to your domestic firms. Now, none of this has to have like a negative connotation. Some of that might well be solve for domestic provision of public goods, maximize the positive externalities of technology. Like all of that is going to be allowed, okay? The part that we're going to be interested in is that the countries are anticipating that the hegemon will come knocking in the middle. So they're thinking about how do I shape my own economy ahead of time to withstand the threats and coercion later. Okay, so we're going to focus on the part of the policy that comes from thinking about how shaping your own economy is going to impact what the hegemon is going to do later. And so that's a big topic now in policy. It's called anti-coercion policy or economic security policy. Is do I want to be, for example, very dependent on a foreign country? Do I have to tell my firms that they cannot import all of the materials from one source? All of that policy is what we're going to focus on. Okay, that's going to be the game. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so I promised you that the participation constraint was key. Now let's look at it formally. So each foreign entity in the middle, it's comparing the inside option, which is producing with a full set JI of all of the inputs you can access to undisturbed, but taking on some costly actions and making transfers. Versus an outside option, which is no costly actions, no transfers, but you produce with a subset of the goods. Okay? J with a circle for outside option. So if you look at the value function, on the inside option, they're choosing the vector of intermediate inputs to use, the vector of factors, they're maximizing profits, but they're perceiving some wedges. They're perceiving wedges that they have accepted from the hegemon and wedges that their countries have imposed in the previous period. And the stars here are reminding you that in equilibrium, this gets rebated. But each firm takes X star as given. So they perceive the cost. Okay, that's how wedges work out in these models. And the outside option is very similar. I'm now producing with only a subset of the available inputs, but I'm only subject to domestic policy. and I make no transfers, okay? That's it. The welfare functions, I think they're pretty straightforward. I mentioned that for both the hegemon and each country, they're maximizing the indirect utility of the consumer. The only thing I want to highlight is when you look at the wealth of the hegemon, it has one more component, right? It has the profits of its domestic firms, the factor payments of the domestic economy, and the transfers it gets from the rest of the world. The rest of the world has, for the firms that don't get bullied, the profits. For the firms that get bullied, because in equilibrium they're going to accept the contract, is the value of the outside option. Or is the value of the inside option minus the transfers, since the constraints will always bind, is really the value of the outside option. And then you have factor income. Okay? So let's start solving it. First, let's solve an example together so that we see a closed form, and then I'll give you a general formulation. First, I promised that we were going to get rid of this u and n of z for now, so let's just set it to 0. The other thing which is connected with what I was just replying to now is I'm going to make it even stronger. I'm going to assume that the consumer has linear utility, which means that prices in equilibrium are going to be constant. Okay, so the entire variation is going to come from the z's, from the technology. Okay, I'm going to have no terms of trade manipulation. All of the prices are going to be constant. And later I will show you what happens when the prices are endogenous. It's going to make us focus on the z's. Okay, good. Okay, so let's visualize that economy to something that we can solve in closed form to get some ideas. Let's say that the hegemon is the US. It has a single country, has a single sector. It has bankers, so local labor factors that produce financial services linearly out of labor. Okay? The rest of the world is a collection of identical small open economies. They only have two sectors. They have a domestic sector that is essentially the domestic alternative to the US. It's a sector of local bankers that use labor to produce local financial services. Okay? In the middle, I have an intermediary, this blue eye, that takes the local variety and the global one coming from the US, puts them together, and creates a composite good. Okay? I'm going to do an example with payment services, but you could do information technology. It's totally generic, okay? Where are the externalities going to be? On the domestic side of H, I'm going to have an external economy of scale. I'm going to assume that the bigger the domestic sector, the more productive it is to use it for the intermediary. On the global one, I will have a strategic complementarity across the sectors. I'm going to assume that for each intermediary, it's more productive to use the global technology if all of the intermediaries in its country and in the other countries are also using it. Okay? So you can think of like this. The example we had in mind when we created the paper was SWIFT, the messaging system or the payment system. It's productive for me to use it because every other country is using it, and so we can send messages and payments to each other. I have a domestic alternative. If it's not scale up at all, it's going to be very inefficient to use it. As soon as I start scaling it, it's going to be at least more efficient domestically to use that alternative. Okay, good. We're going to make functional form assumptions about the intermediary, and it's one that you're going to be very familiar with. And we're going to use it all over the place in the next 2 hours, so just get familiar with it again. It's a CS aggregator. It's combining the domestic alternative to the global alternative. Where are the externalities that we just discussed hidden? They're hidden in the productivities of using the two alternatives. So you can see that for the global one, the productivity for intermediaries in countries J depends on the average usage of that technology across all other countries, with the strength of the externality being governed by Xi. Okay, the higher is Xi, the more as they use it, this becomes productive for me. And if Xi is 0, then there is no externalities. The domestic economies of scale has the same functional form, but only depends from what other intermediaries in my own countries are using. So it's an external economy of scale. You have to make some assumptions to maintain the problems being convex. That's it. Okay? Okay, now let's solve it. So this one we're gonna do as a warm-up. Okay, so before we solve the actual problem, let's do 2 warm-ups together. The first is the global planner. It's the standard benchmark of international macro. I have a global planner that has all the instruments and is trying to maximize global welfare. So here is a planner that is maximizing the sum of welfare of all the countries. Okay? And this is also where I'm going to take a little bit of a detour and go through the primal approach. And if you've seen it, it's pretty straightforward. If you've never seen it, this isn't quite the full general theory of it, but it's a useful introduction in an environment that is simple to visualize. Okay, so please stop me if you have questions about the technical aspect. Okay, so let's think about this. First, you just did a problem set with me for a planning problem. Here's one. Since the countries are symmetric, the global planner optimals has symmetric allocations. So I'm going to focus on what it does to a particular country generically. It's maximizing profits. And here it is. It's the intermediary profits the intermediary output and revenue minus the cost. So the first order conditions is pretty standard. This is the standard part that comes from taking as given the technology, figuring out how much do you want to use of each of the two instruments. This is the first order condition for the use of the hegemon for country J inputs. But then, because it's a planner and we assume that it internalizes everything, it's taking derivatives over the externalities, over the A's. So this is the production externality. It's taking into account that as I increase the usage of good J by intermediary I, so as I increase the usage of the hegemon technology from each of the countries, that increases the productivity from everybody else. And then in particular, I need to scale it so that I get the appropriate output elasticities, okay? So if I were not doing a planner problem, if this was competitive with small countries, this would be zero. They wouldn't be taking derivatives over this object, right? They would take the technology as given. They would think that I'm too small, nothing that I do affects the technology. Okay, good. Now, do the same thing, but for each intermediary in the decentralized economy that faces wedges. So you can see that here, I didn't have the wedges. I simply said, suppose that the planner had complete instruments and could directly choose how much each intermediary uses of each good. That's what we solved. Okay? Now go back and say, okay, let's go back to the problem of each intermediary. Let's figure out their first order conditions when they're facing wedges. Okay? Wedges on both the usage of the foreign inputs and the domestic alternative. What do I get? I get something that is pretty similar to the previous one. I have the optimal usage of J, taking as given the technology. I have lost the part where I take in derivatives over the level of technology. But now I have a wedge on this side, right? I perceive the price of the technology not to be PJ, but to be PJ plus tau EJ. Okay? Good. So that's the first order condition. Now, what is the name of the game of doing the primal approach? Is that we're going to try to figure out a set of wedges that induce the first order conditions of the private entities to be aligned with the planner solution given those wedges. Basically, what are we doing? We're comparing the global planner first order condition, that's up here, to the first order condition that we just derive from each intermediary privately doing its best given the wedges. And then we're going to put them together and solve for the wedge. Now, how do we do it? Well, take this first object, okay, and then multiply through and bring it to the other side. Then the left-hand side is identical. On the right-hand side, in one I have Pj plus tau Ej. In the other one I will have Pj plus this object times this. Right? That's what I wrote here. So that equalize for this. Now stare at it again. And remember that from this condition, I know that this part is simply Pj tau Ej. This one is simply a functional form. If you work out the math of that derivative, it turns out to be psi j. That's why we chose that particular functional form. So now I solve. And that's it. That's the solution. That is the primal approach. Is you start with the planner, directly dictating quantities. Then you look at the private solution of each entity in the game looking at the wedges, and you're trying to look for wedges that implement in that equilibrium the planner solution. Okay, it's a very general tool, and is very helpful for optimal policy. Here we're going to use it all over the place. So that's the outcome. The outcome is not surprising. The outcome is, as a planner, I understand that there are two positive externalities. The domestic alternative gets more productive the more they use it, and so does the global technology. I want to subsidize use of both in proportion to the strength of the externalities. Okay? That's a very intuitive solution for the planning problem. So just to wrap this up, when can you use it? First, you're thinking about having context optimization so that you know that the intermediaries problems have a unique solution. You have to have complete instruments. I assume that the planner had enough instruments that it could directly dictate the choices, okay, the quantities in the allocation space. Under those conditions, you can use it, and we're going to use it all over the place, okay? If you haven't seen this a lot, I suggest spending some time with it and getting familiar with it. It's a very useful tool. Okay, so let's take this one here. We know what happens in this model if we go through a standard benchmark of a planner. Just to take it for a spin, let's consider another benchmark. Before we go back to our game with the hegemon coercion, let's think of a world where there's no hegemon, okay? And every country is choosing domestic policy in a Nash game. So every country is choosing its domestic wedges, taking as given everybody else's policy choices. Okay, and for simplicity, let's take the limit where there are infinitely many small open economies. So everything is essentially taken as given by each country. Okay, good. So let's look. So we're going to do a primal approach again. So we're going to look at the problem of each intermediary. Okay, and we're going to say, look, the same derivation as before are going to dictate that each intermediary so each government fully subsidizes the domestic technology in exactly the same way that the planner would have done it. You can go through the math, and I strongly encourage you that you do it and convince yourself, but intuitively it makes sense. It's an externality that occurs entirely within the border of that country. Therefore, the domestic government fully perceives it and fully internalizes it. It's also intuitive that if you were to look at how much does each government decide to tax or subsidize the usage of the global technology, the answer is zero. It neither taxes nor subsidizes. Where does that come from? It comes from the fact that each government perceives the global technology to be taken as given. It perceives that this country is too small to affect it, and therefore neither taxes nor subsidizes it. Okay? This is special. It comes from the continuum result. What is generic in these planning problems, which shouldn't be surprising to you, is the fact that you normally under-tax or under-subsidize externalities that occur across countries when you're doing a Nash game, because you don't see part of the externality. So if it's a positive externality, you end up under-subsidizing it. If it's a negative externality, you end up under-taxing it. You under-react, because you don't see part of what's going on. Okay, that's the only generic result. Good. Okay, so that's what I just said. Let's take this one here. You can see that the way I'm building it, I'm keeping the right-hand side constant, and all of the variation is coming from here, okay? It's going to make us easier to compare the cases. Now let's go back to what we wanted to solve. So we figured out the tools. We figured out two of the basic benchmarks. We did the warm-up. Now we can go back to the actual thing we want to solve. And we're going to solve it in two stages. First, we're going to solve the offense. What the hegemon asks for. What is the optimal choice of the taus that the hegemon imposes on foreign entities? And what are the optimal transfers? Then we're going to do one step backward in the induction and figure out what are the optimal policies that each country pursues on its domestic economies, or in its domestic firms. Okay, let's start from here. So first, let's do it visually, okay? So think of the intermediate in country I. We've assumed constant prices, so the marginal revenue curve is flat. Doesn't matter how much it produces, the price is constant. The marginal cost curve, it's increasing because we've assumed that the production function is decreasing with tensor scale. So the value of the intermediary is this area, is the color area in the middle. Okay, this is like basic micro. At the inside option, this is the total value. At the outside option, because we're focusing on restrictions to the intermediary that they cannot use a foreign input, the marginal cost curve has to weakly shift to the left. How much? We don't know. I mean, it's easy to figure out that we use a CS aggregator. So if the inputs are perfect substitutes, it doesn't shift at all. As the inputs become Cobb-Douglas, so a sigma of 0, this thing blows up, right? If you don't have access to the foreign input, you can't produce at all. Okay? Good. So the firm, let's assume for a second, which will turn out to be true, that the hegemon always makes the participation constraint bind. It's kind of intuitive because you can imagine that there is no point here, the way we design it, to leave any slack to the target. So whatever slack you have, you extract it with the transfer. Okay? So the firm or the target country retains the blue area, the outside option. The hegemon extracts the middle area. That's going to be the problem. Remember, I started this by saying, look, we're kind of interested in figuring out, is the pie shrinking? Is the pie getting bigger? Is it constant? The fundamental conflict in this set of papers between the hegemon and the countries is a level versus differences. Power, it's a gap between the inside option and the outside option. If I'm the hegemon, that's what I care about. If you're the target, your welfare is a level, is what you're left with. That creates the issue. Why? Because imagine that the planner, sorry, let me start this again. Think of the planner. The planner, what is done is that he has made sure that he made that colored area as big as possible. He has shifted the inside option as far high as he can. Now imagine if the hegemon starts there, okay? On the one end is good. You can see that given an outside option, pushing the inside option higher, it's good. So in these papers, the hegemon has a feature that comes from the work of Kindleberger of being positive. He wants to provide public goods. He wants to make the technology better. All else equal, moving everybody else inside option up, it's good because I can extract it. But now suppose that it starts there and it checks the outside option. Okay, what is it going to do? It's going to now check whether moving somewhere else is going to maximize the gap. In particular, it could be possible that I can pursue strategies that move the inside option down, so they're destroying value on path, but they move the outside option down even faster. So we're creating a gap. That's going to be what we discussed before of the drug dealer model. I got you all to be just on my system. You all are addicted to it. Your outside options are really bad. I might have wanted to do this inefficiently. Even if it would have been more efficient, all else equal, for you to have some alternative, I just made sure that the equilibrium I prefer is one where you have no alternative. And what that equilibrium really is, which we're going to study in a second, is one where the inside option has come in, but the outside option has moved even faster down. Okay, and that's a nasty aspect of the hegemon. That in practice, it might be willing to destroy value on path if it helps us extract more power, build up more power. Okay, so keep this one in mind. This intuition is very generic in these papers. Okay, now let's do it formally. So let's start from the offense. So we're going to do again the primal approach. We're going to say that the hegemon can directly dictate the answers of what the intermediary should do, and then solve for the wedges. So the wedges are going to be here. There is one word of caution now, which is this applies to the inside option, but not to the outside option. At the outside option, the country that I was trying to bully said, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to deal with you. So I no longer have any way to influence them. They're not accepting the wedges. But on the inside option, since they are accepting what I asked them to do, and we set up the paper so that effectively you still have complete instruments, we can still use the primal on the inside option. That's what we're going to do. So we're going to say, look, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to maximize transfers that I get from these countries, because in the simple example that we have, the profits of the hegemons are constant and the factor payment is constant, because everything was produced linearly and the prices are constant. So it's all about extracting transfers. Subject to the intermediary participation constraints, I wrote them out extensively so that you can see the inside option and the outside option. And you can see that at the outside option, we have to take into account that I cannot do the primal. They're going to independently choose what is good for them. Okay? On the inside option instead, these ones, we're going to assume that the hegemon chooses them directly. Okay? That's the problem that you need to solve. Okay, so what you do is first, you figure out that indeed the transfers are always set so that the constraints bind. That means that you can substitute the transfers out with the participation constraint. Now you're left with this, the inside option and the outside options. And then here's where it goes. Okay, I'm only going to do the intuition. So the hegemon is internalizing at the inside option that as I get more people to use my technology, the technology is going to be attractive for everybody else. Okay, so that I'm going to fully internalize. Notice that the way we set up the model, this is not affecting the outside option, because at the outside option, they don't retain any access to the technology. Okay, and that's going to matter for the particular result that we're going to get. Okay. Now look at what happens when the hegemon is choosing how much they should use their home alternative. That is going to internalize not only that as they use it on path, that is increasing the on-path value for everybody else in that country to use it, but also, and more importantly, that's going to affect their outside option. The hegemon understands that as he tells each of the countries to scale down their usage of the domestic alternative, it's destroying some value at the inside option because it's making it less productive, but it's also making the outside option of everybody else a lot worse. Okay, so that's going to be the game. So if you solve it, which it's again doing the same exact math, I just did it fully for the planner because it was so simple that you could do it on slides. This one is just the same process, but you just have to look at the equations a little longer. If you do it, you end up with this. Okay, so what does it do? The offense is I tell you that you have to increase how much you use on my own system. And in fact, I tell you to do it up to the anti-coercion wedges just as much as the planner would have. That's the sense in which the paper has an hegemon that all else equal is pretty benevolent. It does exactly what the planner would have done. It says, look, this global technology is efficient. I want you to use it. The problem and where there is a difference with the planner is that I'm going to tell you not to use the alternative. I'm going to tax it. I want you to have no outside option. That is inefficient from the planner perspective. It's very efficient for the hegemon. It's optimal for the hegemon because of the gap mentality. Okay, and so I'm going to tax it. Okay, this one we're done. So that's the offense. Now let's do the defense. Okay, so now we're taking a step back and we're saying, okay, each country understands that this is going to happen in the middle. They can choose domestic wedges to shape their economy in a way that is going to affect the equilibrium in the middle. Visually, what's going on is that anti-coercion here takes a very simple form for now, which is I'm trying to push the outside option on my firms up. I know they're going to get bullied. I want to make sure that I'm not so dependent on the hegemon. I want to make sure that we have good outside option. You can see that it's very practical. Right now, if you open the newspapers, there's lots of news on we're trying to decrease our dependency on the US if you're Europe, or on China if you're the US. Everybody's thinking, I have all these dependencies to foreign big countries, and I'm worried they're going to squeeze me. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to try to build up my alternative. China thinks the same about the US and says, look, I want to have my own payment system because they might use it against me. So that's exactly the logic that we're going to exploit. Okay? So let's see it. In this particular example, if you work it out, it's pretty straightforward. And you will see that I rigged it in a particular way. So the outcome is you ban dealing with the hegemon. You tell your firms you're going to face an infinite tariff if you use any of the global technology. And then you subsidize to the efficient level the domestic technology. Okay? The result is entirely specific to the setup. It generates full fragmentation, and you will see in a second why I want it. In general, what you're going to get is I'm simply going to want to walk away some of the dependency to make sure that I maintain more of an outside option. Okay? Now let's see why it occurs. Thinking about the outside option, look at the optimal anti-coercion. So the key observation is that the country's intermediaries outside option directly depends only on the productivity of the alternative. So what gives me the infinity, the full ban, is the fact that there is no advantage at the outside option from anything you do at the inside option. Okay? As soon as we break the setup and allow that some of what you retain on the outside option depends on you participating on the inside option, you move away from that result, okay? But that's where it comes from. Okay, good. This one I think is pretty straightforward. Let's just skip it. Okay, so here we are. Okay, now we have the full solutions. So you can see that I did the setup to have the home alternative always face the same policy no matter what, so that we compare what's happening on the other side, on the usage of the global technology. So if you think about it, in the middle, the hegemon was hyper-globalizing. The hegemon was trying to generate more usage for its own global technology compared to the home alternative than the planner would have liked. So one message is that a hegemon in this setup wants to globalize much more than a planner would, as long as the globalization makes it very central, okay? The second part is that, okay, if you go one step backward and you think of countries anticipating it, the message here is pretty stark. It's telling you that the hegemon has all the power. I gave it exogenous powers to make these offers. Even has all the bargaining, is making take it or leave it offers. But we rigged it so that it was so coercive and was generating too little value for the rest of the world, so that ex ante, every country moves away. You get full fragmentation, and in equilibrium, the hegemon has no power. In this model, in this outcome, in this particular incarnation, the hegemon has no power in equilibrium, because he has no relationship with anybody. And that goes to the question that one of you asked me at the beginning about commitment. This isn't commitment to the threat, to carrying out the threats. But here you can start thinking, okay, maybe I would have been better off if I were the hegemon to commit to only limited bullying, or to commit to find ways to leave you some surplus. Here you're so scared of me that I end up vanishing my entire power in an attempt to bully you all the time. And so that brings up something that we can think about, which, for those of you that take Kyle's trade class at Stanford should be familiar, because Kyle and Bagwell, Kyle and Steger, Bob Steger, did a lot of work on this with the WTO, which is, for a long time, me personally, I was convinced that if I was going to write a paper about an international organization, I was going to start with the planner problem, and then think about the organization as a way to implement the planner. Now I kind of changed my mind. I think the right way is closer to what Kyle and Robert did, or close to what the political scientists have been pushing, which is to think of the problem as I have a hegemon, and is trying to design a multilateral deal that constrains his own actions, but it's entirely self-serving. And so I really come to think of the view of the IMF, the WTO. These are deals that the US offers that informally have the following flavor. You can be in my sphere of influence, and yeah, there will be some bullying, but you're gonna retain a lot of value. And I'm constraining my hands to convince you that you should participate. And you can think a lot of what has been happening in the last few years has been a massive or a drastic rethink of that offer. So let's just sketch it, okay? Suppose that you take the previous model and you say, look, what I'm gonna do is commit to only extract a fraction of the inside option value as transfers. Okay? So I'm not going to extract it all. I'm going to leave you some. It's like a bit of an equity contract. Okay? Well, it's very clear that if I set the fraction to 0, then the hegemon doesn't care because it's getting nothing out of this. If I set it to 1, we go back to it's too strong, you don't trust me. Somewhere in the middle, you can prove that there is an equilibrium where they don't do full fragmentation. They actually have a relationship with you. Hence, you have some power and you extract positive rents and you're better off. Okay? So I think it's really a view of commitment and multilateral organizations are sort of limiting coercion. And I think it matters. And I suspect that, in the next 5 years, there'll be lots of papers in this space. And if you're a student thinking of, for example, when I have two hegemons with the US and China, what kind of deals they should offer? What does commitment look like when they're competing? All of that, there is surprisingly little formal work, or even I would say good thinking, like clean thinking. So it's a good area. Okay. Before I go to much more ugly formulas, I want to do some intuition, and then I'll show you the full formulas. To me, the one that I really like are these first two. So what did we really learn from these papers? We learned that there is a fundamental trade-off between the gains from trade and economic security. Think of the standard argument of the gains from globalization. They arise from specializations, external economies of scale. That's the Krugman argument. It's me and Zule, we specialize in different things. We both get good at what we do. That's very efficient, and then we trade with each other, and that leaves us better off. Inspect that argument again. Hidden in that argument is that the markets exposed are not contestable. There is no hold up. If I pay the price, I get the goods. What if Zule can hold me up and say, look, exposed, I'm not going to sell you the things that I produce. Now, my problem is that I specialized. The same exact thing that was generating a gains from trade is also generating the fact that now I have a very poor outside option. The technology that I didn't specialize in, that she specialized in, I'm now not good at. And that tells you that the trade-off is deep. It's not accidental. It's not as if there are two forces and somehow they go in opposite direction. No, it's the same force. And it comes from thinking about the hold-up problem. So it's telling you that there is a deep trade-off between the gains from trade and economic security, and that part of what we're doing now globally is that we're rethinking about where we want to be on that surface. And that we might want to be, for example, in a place that is more secure at the cost of giving up some of the gains from trade because we perceive that the hold-up problem is there. Okay, so that's really what these papers deliver. It's just a different take on the basics of trade theory once you're thinking about hegemonic powers. In the particular context of this, it also has a nasty feature because if you solve the game, remember that here anti-coercion policy is being done by each country taking as given the anti-coercion policy of everybody else. So they're still doing Nash ex ante. Okay? What does it mean? It means that you can show that there's a bit of a fragmentation doom loop. Here, each country starts to say, I want to pick a different point on the frontier. I want to be more secure, and pulls out of the global technology a little bit. But as that country pulls out, the technology has become less attractive for everybody else. So they pull out a little bit more. But as they pull out, the original country wants to pull out even more. So you get a bit of amplification. You get the fragmentation doom loop. So you can end up with an equilibrium where you're overly secure, but you gave up too much of the gains from trade. And it would have been better off doing some coordinated policy. Okay, good. The last few slides before we switch to empirics, let me start with the general theory. So if you remove all of the special assumptions that I introduced, all of the structure of CS, the fact that we switched off the terms of the utility function, the fact that we made prices constant by having linear utility, if you go back to the first 5 slides in their full generality and you solve, what does it look like? Well, first of all, no closed forms, but also you have many more terms. Why is it useful? It's useful only because it's helping you capture what are the standard forces and what's new here. So what are the standard forces? So think of the hegemon in the middle. So this is what the hegemon is imposing as a wedge on what I is buying from J. Okay, so as I do it, the first thing that is happening is that for example, if I subsidize it, as that activity increases, it's going to feed to the entire input-output matrix through the level of technology, through the level of all the aggregate Zs. Okay, that's going to be like a gigantic sort of propagation matrix, like a Leontief inverse. Why do I care about it? Well, this is the standard terms. I care about it because it ultimately affects the profits of my firms. Or I care about it because it directly impacts a term in the utility function that I care about. So let's make an example. I'm looking at semiconductors, and I'm imposing a tax that says, I don't want you to export these semiconductors to China. Why do I care? I care because the semiconductors are going to impact all of their downstream industries, all of the other countries, and all of the input-output matrix. But ultimately, I only care for two reasons. Either because it's going to make my own firms more profitable, or because it's shrinking activities that I didn't want to occur. For example, you can think of like a downstream military application. I want that military sector to be small. I care to tax semiconductors exports to China because ultimately with the input-output matrix, I know that shrinks the military application. Okay, and that's the sense in which I said, look, despite the fact that these utility terms are totally made up, they're useful only in seeing how they would play out in the equilibrium. Okay? So these are pretty standard. The other term that is even more standard, you've all taken trade with Steve Redding, so I know that you know this, which is in terms of trade manipulation. Now I have prices moving around. I care about manipulating an activity if it does the following. It increases the prices of what I export, and it decreases the prices of what I import. As you know, like for example, the classic formula for the optimal tariff is essentially one that aims to manipulate the terms of trade. Right? I'm trying to get the foreigners to lower their prices for what I import from them. Okay, that's a standard term. Then I have some private distortions here that come from the fact that there were some pre-existing wedges. These you can ignore. Okay, what's new? What are the terms that are not there in the standard analysis? Is these terms here. That's what we've been focusing all along, is building power. In fact, in the previous one, if you think about this, those terms were all zero. These by assumption, because I make the utility term not be there. This one, because I made the linear technology being the only thing that the US has, so there is no way to affect the profits of the US. And this one, because we simply said, let's make the consumer linear, that's not there. So in the previous, in the incarnation I gave you, everything was coming from this term. Now, what are they? As I impact the activity ij, that's going to impact what everybody else is doing through the propagation in equilibrium. For all of the foreign firms, that reflects on the value of their inside option and the value of their outside option. This is the gap. Why do I care about it? That's my power. In the previous example, that's all I extracted. That was the transfer. So now you can see formally that what I'm doing is I'm manipulating activity ij. They themselves only care about their cost to them privately of that activity. I take into account how that one spills to the entire equilibrium and how it affects the inside and outside options of everybody else. And that's the entire previous example was characterized in this term, building power. Now the same has to be true if I go through prices. If I impact activity ij through the equilibrium amplification, that's going to impact the vector of general equilibrium prices. Given the change in prices, that's going to impact the inside option and the outside option of everybody else. And it's entirely coming from the participation constraint. So now you can see that we've gone full circle. I promised you ex ante that there were three things to pay attention to. The participation constraint, you can see why. It's all our definition of building power. The wedges as costly actions, that's what I'm solving for. And the externalities and the equilibrium amplification, that's entirely where the effects are coming from. dz dx, dp dx. That's where it's coming from, all of it. And you can see that it's just a separate term from the rest. Now, they interact. So here's an interesting one. Think about the typical optimal tariff. What I want to do is I want the foreigners to lower prices of what they sell to me. But that might be in conflict, for example, with power building. I might want to live into a world where I sell my stuff very, very cheap. It gets everybody to use it, to not build an alternative, and then I extract power by threatening individually to kick you out. Okay? But that's where they come from. Questions? Okay, good. So if you do anti-coercion, it's a pretty similar formula. So we said, look, there is lots and lots of reasons to do domestic policy in these economies. So we said, look, suppose that we totally ignore the hegemon. We already know that there's plenty of reasons to do intervention. You might, for example, want to sort out some domestic positive or negative externalities. You might want to try to manipulate some prices. Those are here. I care about intervening because it changes some activities that I control. It feeds through the Leontief inverse, and ultimately I only care if it's spilling back on my firms. I said that we were going to focus on a distinct component, which we call anti-coercion, which is I care because I understand that by changing that activity, I'm going to change the request that the hegemon would make next period, and those requests impact the profits of my firms, particularly at the outside option. So that's the term that we characterized in the previous example is this object. Okay? Okay, good. So for the last part, we're going to do two things. First, we're going to take everything we just did and bring it to the data in a sufficient statistics approach. So if you're taking a trade class, this is very, very familiar to you. We're going to use structure from a model and the data to figure out counterfactuals. A lot of what we focused on right now has been the gap between the inside and the outside option. The outside option, we don't see it. In this paper, for example, in that theory, is never realized. So the question is, how can I use what I see about the inside option to infer what would have happened at the outside option? To make it practical, imagine that you think about what happens to me if I lose access to Chinese rare earths. Okay? And it's a question that is very familiar to trade economists because one counterfactual that they're very interested in is what happens if I shut down trade in its entirety? So what is the cost of autarky? Okay, here we're not going to go to autarky, we're going to go to losing a particular collection of inputs, but a lot of the same technology is going to be helpful. So we're going to do a bunch of that. And then we're going to switch gears and look at what we're doing with AI. Okay, and thinking about if there are threats and there's a lot of uncertainty and maybe the asks are difficult to pre-specify, can we use non-standard sources of data to figure out who's doing what to whom? Okay, good. So let's start with this one. So let's do a warm-up to remind ourselves of how this works. Okay, I'm sure you've seen it, but let's just do it once in a simplified setting, and then we're going to scale it up. So imagine that we go back to a simple example of I have a production function that produces with decreasing returns to scale beta. Xn is a CS basket of intermediate inputs J. And here's my elasticity of substitution. So you can see that if I set sigma to 1, I'm getting to Cobb-Douglas. In Cobb-Douglas, if I lose any of the varieties J, the whole basket blows up. I can't produce anything. So anything more complementary than Cobb-Douglas will imply full loss of production if you lose any one of those inputs. Again, to remind you of the analogy with trade, that's part of the reason why you get infinite cost of autarky if you're in a sort of Cobb-Douglas setting with foreign inputs. That defines a price index that you're familiar with, and it defines expenditure shares, which are the fraction of the expenditure that falls on particular inputs. Okay? What we're going to play again and again with is this, is that the log profits of this producer are a constant plus the log of the price index. So it's helpful to think of everything that is going on as variation in the price index. Before we phrase it as variation in the marginal cost curve, here we're going to keep track of that as a price index for the optimal set of inputs. So if I'm losing some inputs, for example, the price index will tend to go up. Okay, so everything can be traced as this. Let's have a look at this. What are we really doing? We're looking at the log between the inside option producing with the full set of inputs versus the log of the outside option producing with only a subset of inputs. It's exactly what we've been playing around all the time so far. Well, there's the previous formula. That's going to be the log ratio of the two price indexes. And so you can see that we're going to start thinking about how bad it is to lose some inputs in terms of the effective price index that I'm facing. We write it out. We get our nice expenditure shares. It tells me that I tend to lose more if the inputs that I were using were a bigger fraction of my expenditure on path. And of course, with the elasticity of substitution. As the elasticity of substitution goes to Cobb-Douglas. And we're going to define this object, which is the fraction of the inputs that I'm losing. It's the fraction of the expenditure share in equilibrium that I was sourcing, in some sense, from the hedge fund. Okay, it's what he can take out of me. Okay? So this is familiar to all of you. You've done this derivation before. Just breathe a second, let it sink in, convince yourself that that's what's going on, and then we're just going to take it for a spin. What we're going to do is we're going to nest the CES. Okay? We're going to do multiple nests, and we're going to start thinking about how that affects the ultimate outcome. Okay? So what are we going to do? Let's start from the bottom. The bottom are, for each particular sector, what am I importing of those inputs from all other countries? So these elasticities are going to tell me how substitutable are two foreign sources of the input among each other. So if you go back to our example of oil, we might think that oil has a very high sigma, that Russian oil, Venezuelan oil, and Canadian oil are a little different, but ultimately quite substitutable for me. So if I get cut off from any one variety, the other varieties are going to be great substitutes. Okay, I'm going to move the price index a little bit against me as I try to reallocate to those, but not a lot. Then we're going to have a layer for each of these sectors that mixes the basket of the foreign varieties with the domestic variety. The reason we're going to allow it is for two separate but important reasons. One is that you might think genetically that because of selection, transport costs, because of things that we're not going to really model, the domestic variety and the internationally traded ones are a little different. I think of it as, for example, trivially, let's suppose that we're doing consulting services. Domestic services might include a lot of very trivial stuff. But if we're doing an international project and there's a lot of services crossing borders, probably like some very high value added consultancy that is doing it, and that might not be very substitutable. Okay? It's just a simple reason intuitively to do it. For us, there's a different reason to also do it, which is if you're thinking about being cut off, one thing that matters a lot is the size of your domestic economy. The first thing that makes you secure is you can produce it yourself. So the home share is very important, particularly if you are very large countries. For a continental size economy like the US, China, Western Europe, the domestic share is a very big deal. And this is obvious to the trade community because, again, if you go to the calculation of the cost of autarky, it tends to be relatively small for countries that import very little, that they have a huge domestic economy. It tends to be very high if you're Singapore, because so much of your GDP comes from the import and the export. But that's going to be quite important. And keep this in mind because I'm going to argue that this is the hardest part to measure. And that it leads to a little bit of a policy mistake because generally, at least for manufacturing goods, the foreign data is surprisingly much better. Why? It comes from the simple fact that every country for the last 200 years is at a customs office because we've had tariffs. So whenever a manufacturing good crosses border, it generally leaves a trace. So the data for that is surprisingly good. That means that a lot of the time gets spent on computing how much do we import from China? What fraction of this whole thing comes from China? Or China does the inverse with the US. But suppose that I tell you that 90% of what we import in this particular category is from China. Well, that might still generate a tiny dependency if overall 90% of the total usage in that category is coming from the domestic share. Okay, but somehow, because we don't have that data for many goods, that doesn't quite get as much attention as one would think. So keep that one in mind. Okay, so now we have a composite basket that includes the domestic production. Now we're going to go and aggregate across industries. Okay, so we're mixing, I don't know, electronic equipment with cars, with other things. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, at the very end, take this basket of all other goods and mix it with finance. And you will see in a second why I'm keeping finance separately. I want to think of a world where those are basic financial services and where essentially little gets done if you don't have the ability to make payments, where it's sort of almost Cobb Douglas in everything else. Okay? You can nest in many different ways depending on how you want to set up the economy, but let's explore this one. Okay, now take the previous formula and just rederive it with many nexts. It's the same thing over and over again, right? The trick is precisely by thinking of them in price indexes. You're starting from the outermost and then you keep nesting, and the formula just keeps going that way. It's one of the beauties of the nested CS. So the final log differences are this. That's going to be our notion of power. It's the notion of how much of a in percentage loss of the value added of the target can I inflict if I restrict the inputs. The red ones, let's start from the big omegas. These are on-path expenditure shares. For example, this omega here tells you what fraction of the expenditure share of the target are on the basket of all other goods and finance. The second one here tells you for each of the baskets of manufacturing, what fraction of the expenditures are on equipment, cars, and so on. This one here, it's the one that we were just discussing. It's telling me what fraction within that basket it's coming from foreign varieties versus domestic. So if omega, this big omega, is very close to 0, it's telling you that almost everything is coming from domestic production. And then I have this little omega. This tells me for that particular basket, among the foreign varieties, what fraction is being controlled by the hegemon. So if you're thinking of the US as the hegemon, is what fraction am I importing from the US? Or you can flip it and make China your hegemon and say, what fraction of everything that I import is coming from China? So this little omega is what gets a lot of attention, for example, in the press or in the policy circles. When we say that 90% of processed rare earth come from China, or statements like that are generally about this. And this does matter, and we're going to explore it in a second. But I want to convince you that that's not the only thing that matters. And then in particular, trivially, the domestic shares are quite important. Let alone, of course, how it aggregates up. You will see in a second that I already previewed that we're keeping finance separately because we would like it to shift the aggregates quite a lot. Okay? Good. Now, this is the trick of the sufficient statistics in trade. This is really what ACR did. Arkolakis, Costino, and Rodriguez-Clare. These shares are equilibrium shares. These I can measure. They're expenditure shares in the data. What fraction of all things in these sectors are import from China? The blue objects is the nasty part. Those are elasticities. And since you have taken the trade class, you know that that's not good news, because we tend not to have great estimates of elasticities. There's lots of estimates all over the place. And particularly as we disaggregate, as we go to finer and finer things, it gets harder. Imagine trying to estimate what is the elasticity of substitution between a frontier semiconductor from NVIDIA and one that is just below the frontier from Huawei? That's hard, okay? But it helps you to constrain your own view and debate of what do you have to believe, for example, to get big numbers or small numbers. And so I find it very helpful, even if there is substantial uncertainty about these objects. So to make it simple, we're going to start with making the outer nest Cobb-Douglas. So we're going to say that if you have no finance at all, if you have no ability to make payments, you can't produce. Okay? It's both because we want it to be important, but also because it's something that people refer to as the idiot law of elasticities, which is if you don't know the number, set it to 1 and do Cobb-Douglas. So we're going to do that. Then for the rest, we're going to take from the handbook chapter from Arnaud and Rodriguez-Claire, we're going to take an elasticity of 6 for all other sectors. We're going to assume, and take it a little bit from the literature, that finance is special. We're going to assume that it's very difficult to not use SWIFT. It's very difficult to not use the US financial system. So we're going to give it a very low elasticity of substitutions, like in the 1.7 range. And then this is what I mentioned. We're going to borrow an assumption that the domestic variety is less substitutable with the foreign basket that each foreign variety is with itself. Okay, and this comes from a paper from Finstra and Maury Opsfeld. Pick the elasticities the way you like them, run through the formula, okay? Okay, so first, let's explore these nonlinearities, okay? So let's focus on the inner bucket. This is the price index of movement of being cut off from the hegemon at the inner bucket level, at the lowest level of the baskets. So what we did is we picked all bilateral omegas across countries vis-a-vis the US and China, across sectors, and these are the kernel smoothed densities. So first, stare at this index. It tells you that there are two very important nonlinearities. The losses become infinite when little omega approaches 1, where the entire basket is being cut off. Why? Because it's telling you that the way to get the firm not to use it at all is to make it perceive that the good costs infinity. And we said it already when the sigma gets very, very close to 1. Now this one, which is a standard feature of CES, I'm going to argue is very, very important for geoeconomics and has some pretty interesting implications for the nonlinearity of power. But first, let's convince ourselves that it's somewhat relevant. For example, if you look at financial services, it's no surprise to you that there are many bilaterals where 80, 90% of all imported financial services come from the US and its allies. Essentially, you're most importing financial services from the US, Belgium, Luxembourg, London, Germany, places like that. It's very, very concentrated. When you say that China, it's a very large exporter and a powerhouse in manufacturing, is this one here. That is kind of shocking or amazing that for a single country, the import dependency, as in the fraction of goods that get imported from China, is very often in the 20 or 30% from that single destination, okay? But what's important is that this, you can see, at least in this functional form, is gonna really kick in for very high shares, like in the 0.9, 0.95, that's really when it kicks in. Let me pause for a second on this because I want to mention two things. So why do I care so much about this? Well, first, because it's telling you, and I'm going to get back to this when we do AI, it's giving you a definition of what, for example, a choke point is. What dependencies do you care about? It's telling you that the ones that you have to be scared about are the ones where there is a very dominant player, where there is almost no alternative and the little omega is very close to 100%. Or places where the elasticity of substitution is very, very low, something where technologically is very hard to do without. So you can see that, rare earths, advanced semiconductors, finance are gonna smell a little bit like that. There's sectors that have some of those characteristics. And we might argue that we don't know exactly the elasticity for semiconductors or how well do you really control the entire supply chain. But it gives you a very simple way that an economist will recognize in 2 seconds for what a dependency is. Flip side, it also tells you that most sectors generate no dependency whatsoever. This is very nonlinear. So as soon as you move away from that corner, power dissipates very, very quickly. And so if you go back to the motivation that we had at the beginning, Hirschman, this formula is nothing else than 50 or 70 years later, with a lot of help from trade theory and macro theory, a better version of what does it mean to have a dependency on a foreign country. Hirschman had in mind summing the square of the little omegas, is that dependency was, do I have a lot of trade with very few partners? This one says, well, there's something quite intelligent about that, which is precisely the concentration, but it's making it more complicated and saying, well, no, it's really about that to the power of an elasticity, because I need to know how easy it is to rearrange technologically if you cut me off. And of course, that's not the only thing that matters. I need to know, can I produce it domestically? And I need to know how much it impacts other sectors in the economy, all of that. But it's giving you like in some sense, a fully fledged theoretical version that delivers on concentration is very important. It's just a different way. It also has the message that you don't have to go to equal share to get safety. It's just enough to move away from the corners, which I think is an important part. It also has one more message, which we're not going to explore today, but that we're thinking about in a different paper with multiple hegemons, which is that power, by being nonlinear, also means that it's not additive. What does it mean? It means that if I lose power, it doesn't accrue to you, not necessarily. So let me give you the following example. Think of the dominance of finance, and let's consider Singapore, okay? What is the value to the US of controlling Singapore? The value to the US is entirely on the offense. If you control Singapore, given that you control already almost all other financial services, that's going to really put those little omegas close to 1, and that's very important to you. So you accrue a lot of power by controlling this relatively small financial center. Think of the value to China of controlling Singapore. It's not going to make China a financial superpower, but it has potentially a lot of power from a lot of interest for China in diluting US power. But as you dilute US power because they lose Singapore, Chinese power isn't going up by the same amount. So power isn't a sum. Okay, that's quite important when you're thinking about these games. Good. Okay, so if you crank this out, and Chiara is here and she's cranked a lot of these calculations for us, what does it look like? Well, first, for both coalitions, clearly small open economies that trade a lot with these countries tend to have big losses. So Singapore, because it has no domestic shares or a very small domestic economy compared to its imports, and is very dependent on these countries, is going to show as having very large losses. What's interesting is that for the US coalition, a lot of the power comes from finance. They're essentially controlling something that has a very small share of gross output, so it's not a big sector, but it's important for all other sectors, and you control almost all of it. And that gives it a big kick. For China, it's entirely coming out of manufacturing, and it's a lot more substitutable in general. A lot of the things that China sells tend to be things with very high elasticity of substitution, like basic durable goods. Not all of them. Rare earths is a good example, okay? You can do a lot of these calculations in many different ways. You can disaggregate, you can vary the elasticities. There's lots of stuff. I'm going to highlight a few that might be of interest to you if you do research. So first, the level of aggregation does matter, and we've already sort of stumbled a little bit on it. Let's discuss what's allowed and not allowed. So these are calculations that I would describe as the medium run. So think about, even in the theory, what are we allowing? When I cut you off, I fully allow you to re-optimize who you source from and how much. So it's not a very short run. It's not like a Lehman identification for the financial crisis, that the shock happens and you have no time to do that. If we wanted a model of that, we might have done a model where you sent out your orders, all your XIJs for sourcing inputs. Some of them get cut off and you can't change the other ones. That would generate much bigger numbers in terms of losses, because it will say you inefficiently order little from the alternative because you didn't think you were going to be cut off. Now you've been cut off and you're left with a very small order. Here we're not doing that. We're allowing you to potentially increase that order a lot, but there are costs to that. Now, they're not very long-run calculations because, for example, we're not allowing for the equilibrium aggregates and lots of other things to change. We're also calibrating to elasticities that are probably more like medium run in the literature. You might think that, for example, the ability to substitute might depend on time to rearrange your production function, time to do other things. What are other things that are on my mind to tell you as you do this? One is that the level of disaggregation matters. In particular, suppose that the choke points, these nonlinearities, were really at the very fine level, like process rate errors, so those particular semiconductors. Well, if you're doing these calculations with very aggregate data, you kind of smooth them out. Okay, they're mixed with all other equipment or they're mixed with all other metals. You're kind of losing some of that. The problem is that as you disaggregate, two things tend to happen. First, the quality of the data deteriorates quite quickly. The noise in the data goes up a lot. That's particularly true for the domestic share because most countries traditionally do not produce data for the domestic production out of microdata. The data for cross-border is much better. And for cross-border, for example, services are notoriously badly estimated. Why? Because traditionally we don't do tariffs on services. Maybe Trump will change that, but not even Trump so far. And we just don't track them very well. So if you think of, for example, a lot of the power of the US or China, they're competing over information technology, AI, all of that is going to show up in services, like the access to Google. None of that we're very good at measuring it. The other problem is that, of course, as you disaggregate, the elasticities become harder and harder to measure. And you have to be careful because you naturally think, this is come again from the trade literature, you naturally think that as you disaggregate, the elasticities are probably becoming higher and higher. Right? If you go super disaggregated, it's very likely that this particular blue shirt I only import from one country. But that doesn't generate infinite losses because that's a perfect substitute for a blue shirt with a particularly different color from another country. So you think that the elasticities also go up a lot. It's where we are, okay? There's a lot of demand for better work in this dimension. Some of you mentioned the input-output tables. For example, a lot of what China controls might be entering the US indirectly. And so if you're looking at the bilateral direct shares, that might not be the right content. You might be also having to look at the Chinese content in Mexican exports to the US or in Vietnam export to the US. And there are techniques to do that. There's just a lot more to be done. If you're interested in this kind of quantitative empirical work, I think there's just going to be like a whole long wave of work in this dimension as the data gets better and better. In the particulars of what we did, what are other shortcomings? Well, we mentioned the time dimension. What are we allowing to change and not change? What I haven't discussed very much is that to keep the game theory clean, at the very beginning, I kind of explained that here you're cutting off small entities. We're not recomputing prices. That's probably not a great idea if you're doing a calculation of cutting off all of China. You would think that if we cut off all of China, exchange rates, wages, interest rates, lots of stuff will adjust. Now, that means that you need to use other techniques. There are conditions under which you might get away with something that looks like these formulas, but eventually you might have to go to just simply computing two different equilibria in a quantity model. Now, that's expensive computationally, but again, computations are getting easier. There's a whole area there that needs to be explored. That this is only giving you, a first pass. Great. So now let's talk about a very different way to do this. Okay. So what I did so far, in some sense, is very traditional. It's the bread and butter of trade and a lot of macro. We were interested in getting at this also from a different perspective. Now, originally, where we started from was the idea that a lot of these threats, a lot of this pressure might be off-path. If you go back to the example of ASML, of course they're going to comply. because the US has a huge threat on them, and they're going to comply, and I'm not going to see it being cut off in equilibrium. If the US tells a European bank, stop trade financing Iran, or you lose access to the US financial markets, they tend to comply. And so there's a simple endogeneity on some of the most powerful threats. You're never going to see them realizing the data because the target complies. Also, we started thinking a lot of this might be uncertainty, but then it became more interesting in our head. A part that became very interesting to us is what they're asking you to do might be pretty difficult to predict ex ante. Like what are those taus? And that with hard data, it's hard to pre-specify, and we might not always see it. So we started thinking about text. Now, why is text a good place? Well, there is at least two reasons. The first is text, by being narrative and non-structured, potentially captures a lot of things. You can imagine that the CEO of ASML is going to get asked, why did you stop selling stuff to China? And he's going to mumble something along the lines of, we kind of had to, and he's not going to want to be maybe too precise about the pressure, but he's going to mention something. Or a bank that stopped trade financing Iran, or a Chinese CEO that is being asked not to sell something to the US. The other thing that it does is it's available where you let them tell you what the ask was. You don't have to pre-specify it in categories. And so that's what we started thinking about. Okay, so this is obvious to all of you now because you're using AI a lot, but just in case it's not obvious to you, clearly one massive shift of the last 2 or 3 years has been the ability to analyze text. In particular, the ability to extract from the text potentially very sort of dense information. So, like our colleague, Nick Bloom, has been a pioneer at this, all of his work on text and uncertainty. I'm going to mischaracterize a bit of the sort of evolution of the literature, but the way I think of it as a simple-minded thing is, I could do common find. So you give me a document, I can do common find for the word tariff. Does the document mention tariff? Now, that's pretty low quality. A much better natural language processing is like bigrams. We're looking for a combination of words that are of interest to us, and we're comparing them to some baseline frequency in either the English language or in text of that type. So a lot of the work that Nick has done is a feature of that. Okay, and we're looking at how frequently do they mention the word uncertainty or tariff. You can also go a different route, which wasn't very popular in economics, with some exception, but it certainly is popular in political science, which is humans. You write down a long set of instructions that say, please read this document and tell me, put in a spreadsheet, all of the following categorization of the document. Now, the obvious problem is hard to do. We did it with RRAs. One of these documents took about 25 minutes. If you're going to do 1.2 million documents, that's not going to work very well. What AI has really done in shifting the frontier is that it's essentially allowing us to do what we would have liked to do with a human, give them a long set of instructions to extract potentially very complex information out of the text, but relatively speaking with the simplicity of the bigram approach, with an algorithm that just simply looks for it. Now, why is AI, and particularly large language models, very good at this? Again, many of you will know more than I do about this, but it comes from the cross-attention mechanism. Now, what is that? It's essentially a very nonlinear network that is putting weights on words or tokenized that are potentially very far apart in the text, and has been trained to recognize that in the English language, the sequential nature of the language means that words that might be potentially far apart in that context are related to each other. So when we all chat with ChatGPT or Claude, the reason why we really like it, it's really deep down coming from that mechanism. Okay, and that it feels a lot more human than a common find. Okay, so that's what we did. So basically, the corpus of text is the text of CEOs and CFOs of public firms worldwide speaking to investors. And it's a text that has been used a lot before in economics. For example, Nick has used, Tarek Hassan used it a lot. By the way, if you're a student, this is easy text. It's available routinely by data providers, even at Stanford or other universities. We also included analyst reports. Why? Because in this particular context, you have to worry that because it's politically sensitive, the CEOs might be very careful about what they say. Basically, I had in mind that if you're a US CEO, you can bash China all you like, but you're going to be careful when you talk about the US administration. If you're a sitting Chinese CEO, you might have opposite incentives. But you might think that an analyst that is arm's length, somebody that is paid to cover the company, might not have that problem. They might be more than willing to say they're doing this because they're getting pressure from the Foreign Office. Okay? So we did that. The prompts are nothing else than the instructions that if you went for the human approach, you would have given their A's. We published them online. And this is a paper, by the way, with Antonio Coppola. Antonio, the first time he showed me 3 years ago that we could do this, I was totally blown away because I was massively under-ambitious. I thought that we were going to give you like a few words that said, here's the instruction. You showed up with like 3 pages of text. I didn't even know that this was feasible. But they're very detailed instructions. And ultimately, what this is you take the text, you take the prompt, you feed it to an LLM, and you're really using the LLM as a classifier. So ultimately, what comes out of it is a structured data set. In the particular case that what we did, a lot of it is 0-1 variables. Is the firm affected by the tariff? Is the firm positively affected or negatively affected? Some of it is less structured. Tell me which product is affected by the export control. So it might give you an answer that is in words. But most of this is going to be hard classification. Now, if you're a PhD student, let me spend 2 seconds on this. There is at least 2 big considerations. One consideration is open weights versus closed weights models. So the way the landscape of LLMs is right now is changing, of course, very quickly. But as we speak today, a lot of the frontier models are closed weights. What it means is that Claude, ChatGPT, the algorithm and their weights are proprietary to them. You don't see them. You might have some ability to control features of the model. In particular, you might have the ability to make the model deterministic, okay? But ultimately, you don't control it. If they change something in the background, you're not gonna recover your results. Open weights models are different. They're the same architecture, but you can download the weights from Hugging Face. You can put them on the Stanford supercomputer. In a lot of these cases, there are features that make the model deterministic. Essentially, you're going to be able to do narrow replicability in the context that you're familiar with in Python, Stata, or MATLAB, which is same code, same data. If I press the button 1,000,000 times, I get the same result, okay? The other advantage, of course, if you have the weights, is that you might be able to fine-tune yourself. You might be able to modify, add things that you cannot do if you don't have the weights. What are the disadvantages? There's at least 2. The first is the computational infrastructure goes up a lot because now you have the weights and you have to do them. You have to run them. Our experience has been that over the last 3 years, that computational cost and problem has gone down a ton. Quite frankly, 3 years ago, I didn't know how to do this. It seemed like a complicated problem. Now you just tell code, please run this model and give me the answers. So that has also changed a lot. It is still cumbersome compared to an API call, okay? It's a lot cheaper. And in particular, Stanford, unfortunately, I believe right now, this not to be true for students, that you don't have access to the new supercomputer for GPUs, but you have access to parts of it. It's generally a lot cheaper than the commercial services, okay? This is also changing so rapidly that whatever I'm saying, if it's not obsolete already, it's going to be obsolete in 2 weeks. But it does have, these are some of the advantages and disadvantages. In practice, who knows? In the US, most of the frontier models have gone closed weights, although Google keeps releasing close to frontier open weights. In China, they were doing mostly open weights, but Alibaba just switched to closed weights. It's changing. But I strongly encourage you to experiment with this, okay? Now, eventually we get to this. Now, one interesting econometric problem that I'm going to return to is that this is generated data. And you might have to worry about not only the narrow replicability, can I get it back again, but also like, does he have biases? Does he have measurement error that is non-classical? How am I going to do econometrics based on this? And a lot of the recent papers in econometrics are tackling this. It's a very active area, even if you're purely taking the applied part. And I'm going to give you a sense of this. So let's go back to the example I started with. Okay, let's go back to ASML. They have US suppliers, they have Chinese customers, or they used to, and there is the US government pressuring them. They're a public firm, so their CEO and CFO had to do public calls that get transcribed. If I feed their transcripts through the algorithm, what comes out is that the country imposing the pressure is the US and the Netherlands. The country receiving the pressure is China. The firm products are extreme ultraviolet and deep ultraviolet. So you can see that these ones are all R values. This is essentially free text that the algorithm will reply. And then you have to classify it if you want to go to an HS6. The overall impact on the firm is negative. This is a costly action that they were asked to do. What was the action that they were asked to do? Lower sales to China. Okay, and we're going to have 55 of these answers in many dimensions. We're going to ask, did you change supplier? Did you increase the price? Did you lower the inputs? All of this, okay? Good. What are two advantages of this that I haven't mentioned? The first is, particularly for questions in trade and geoeconomics, one advantage, which surely is familiar to you from the trade class, is that trade is very, very heavily dominated by multinationals. From the finance classes, you know that multinationals and large firms are disproportionately likely to be public firms. And public firms produce text. So in this particular context, text is friendly because it comes mostly from public firms, but public firms are not everything you'd like to know, but they're a big chunk of the global trade activity. If I were doing a paper on domestic employment, that might be different. But for these questions, the public text is good. The other thing that I think is interesting, and we only started to exploit it now, is that of course I have text from the suppliers, from the firm itself, and from the potential customers. So one of the things that I want to know, going back to the equations and the counterfactual, is, okay, now this is telling me that the US threatened ASML, that ASML complied, they did take on board the costly action, they stopped selling to China. But now I can go to the previous Chinese customers and I can say, was this expensive or cheap for you? Remember that we have predictions depending on the elasticity of substitutions and the shares, whether this affects the target a lot or very little. And so we can ask, how are they reacting? And what are they doing? Okay, so it's kind of nice because you have text all around the supply chain and you can try to chase it. So we're going to play around a little bit with that. Okay, so let's start from the aggregates, okay? So let's look at export controls. This is a percentage of all publicly listed firms for which we have text that mention being affected by export controls. So you can see that originally this was like not a policy that was being used a lot. And then in recent years, there is a big trend up. Where does it come from? A big chunk is the US pressuring China. That will turn out to be mostly semiconductors. But then you can see here towards the end, a green area opening up. That's the Chinese firms pressuring the US with export controls on rare earths. Now, at this level, you could have probably gotten away with a lot of this with much simpler methods at NLM. You know, for example, in the aggregate, bigrams would have worked pretty well for does the firm mention export controls. Now, our own experience has been if you focus on a policy where there's a keyword like tariff, anybody that is affected by tariff tends to use the word tariff. Then it's easier. Export controls are surprisingly nasty because there's just lots of ways to phrase what an export control is, and AI is quite good at that. But then again, you could have spent a lot of time with the bigrams to figure out all the right combination of words, okay? So I wouldn't do AI for this. If you do it for sanctions, what do you find? The two episodes that you would imagine, these are the sanctions on Russia following the earlier invasion of Crimea and the war in Ukraine. And then in the middle, there's probably an episode that is less familiar to you. Those are the US imposing sanctions on Huawei and ZTE in the Trump one, okay? If you look at tariffs, it's Mr. Trump 1 and 2. They're large tariffs on everybody else that you can see. But now let's try to go deeper. In particular, you can start tracing out who's imposing the pressure, using what sector, and towards whom. And you can see that a lot of the pressure is coming from the US on China using the semiconductor supply chain, and China on the US using rare earths, but you can go a lot more disaggregated, okay? Also, bear in mind that one of the nice things of text is that we might be getting some of this information from a firm that isn't involved. Think of, for example, the sanctions of the US or Europe on Russian oil. A lot of the information might be coming from Chinese firms or Indian firms that are saying, we're very positively affected by the US sanctions on Russian oil because we get cheap oil as a result. Okay, so you get a lot of third-party effects. Okay, good. Now go back to the previous formula, okay, and let's simplify it a bit. So we mentioned this nonlinearity. I get a lot of power or a lot of pressure on the target when 100% of what they were using comes from me, or when the elasticity of substitution is close to Cobb-Douglas, okay? So the plot before here, I just did it in logs, it's here. If you look at the US hard data versus China, it looks like this. Clearly it's off because there is other things that matter, in particular these big omegas here, that in a three-dimensional plot I'm not capturing. And then we started thinking, okay, can we use AI to get a sense about whether these models are capturing the world? Here's an example, okay, and this is very provisional, but it's kind of fun. We started thinking, if I pick firms that are in these particular sectors, what is the probability that they report being used to target China? So here, what we're doing is we're saying, is the US policymaker using the model to pick which sectors to use? Or is he picking at random? And here they are. So a red scale, a red and bigger ball means firms in that sector are much more likely to report being used to pressure China. And you can see that it's a bit of a mixed bag, but overall, they're kind of using the right thing. I think of this as, Jake Sullivan, who was the national security advisor to Biden, saying, for export controls, we want a very high fence on a small garden. We don't want to affect every relationship with China. We want to pick a few sectors and put very, very high controls. This looks a lot like this. I think semiconductors is one of this. This is aircrafts. There is also misses. For example, the US has never used autos vis-a-vis China. But they're not picking a lot that is down here. Now imagine that I did this the other way around. Imagine that I looked at countries exporting to the US and I looked at tariffs. It would look like a Christmas tree, right? We tariffed everybody, including islands with 3 penguins. We didn't say, well, let's only tariff a few countries that really we're a huge customer for them and they cannot find an alternative. One thing that we haven't discussed is in one of the papers that I've assigned you, but I didn't cover it today. Suppose that we switch the threats to not being threats not to sell you something, but we switch it to being threats not to buy something from you. It's essentially the threat of imposing a tariff, if you think of the wedge implementation, or if you want to do a full ban as an infinite tariff. Then what is the theory there? The theory there is that it matters that if to you it matters that I'm telling you a tariff, if once I cut you off from exporting to me, you will have to move the price index of your sales, as in you will have to depress prices at which you sell to find a new customer. So what we're looking for is the elasticity of how easy it is for you to find another customer. So if I'm a big, huge market, I have some power, because if you lose me, in order to sell the same volume, you're going to have to lower prices. And hence, you might be willing to give me a concession. That's the theory of a tariff. If you think of, for example, Russia, if they cannot sell to Western Europe and the US, the example that you had in mind, they need to sell to India and China. But India and China are a relatively small market for Russian exports of oil, and so you're going to depress prices. So allegedly, the estimates are that Russia sells somewhere 30% at a 30% discount. Okay? Imagine that we did that version and then looked at which firms report that they're being used for tariffs. that's going to say they're not using the model, they're picking all sectors. But what we're planning to do, what we're working on is go the other way. Then say, okay, start with this one. Suppose that we are randomized and that we have picked sectors here that the model says it shouldn't matter for the target. That should be very easy for them to find an alternative. Then we can go to the text of the target and say, do they indeed report that being cut off didn't really matter? They could find it easily. And similarly, for the tariff, you can go to sectors and say, they sell to the US and say, look, were they bothered? Did they lose a lot of revenue from the tariff? Well, some sectors might. If you're selling, for example, I don't know, things that only the US buys, like oversized SUVs, that might be a problem. But if you're selling plain stuff where the US is 10% of your customers, you can reallocate pretty quickly, okay? So that's part of what we're planning to do, and this gives you like a first sense. But here's some things that we did do. So, okay, this one on the export control says the US picked a few sectors that look like they use the model, okay? Then you can say, go to China, and how do they react? So this is this panel here. First of all, the firms are reporting that this was expensive. There are many more firms that report that this is negative for them than is positive for them. It's affecting profits. But also look at the response. What is the main response? Domestic R&D. They're saying, look, we lost the semiconductors from the US. We're doing large investments to replace them with a domestic source because we don't want to be cut off in the future. So in some sense, it tells you exactly what you would have imagined to see, a switch to an alternative source. When you look at the US firms, it's expensive to them. That goes to your question of, in the theory, we made it totally inexpensive because you're cutting off a single firm. But clearly, when you're cutting off China, China is a big customer. For NVIDIA, it's pretty expensive not to sell to them. There is an R&D response, but the funny thing is when you look at the text, what are they doing? This is NVIDIA saying, we're doing R&D to develop a chip that the Chinese want, and they're just below the cutoff for export controls in the US. So it's just like bypassing the legislation. And there's a lot of that. What else? So let's go to tariffs, okay? So I gave you an informal rendition of a tariff as a geoeconomic negotiating tool. When you look at tariffs, you can split the firms into positive, these are US firms, into positively and negatively affected. The first thing that you find is that US firms overwhelmingly report being negatively affected by US tariffs. But there is a bunch of firms, here, this blue line, that report being positively affected by the US tariffs. And I want to show you who they are, okay? Now, you've all taken the trade class. What is a tariff? A tariff is, other than a tax on imports, we think of it as a combination of two policies. What are the two policies? Fine, I'll take you out of your misery. It's a consumer tax and a domestic producer subsidy. One of the reasons why economists tend not to like tariffs is because it's an instrument that really is two combined policies, and you might want to have separate instruments that affect one margin but not the other. For example, you might want to have a domestic producer subsidy but without taxing the consumer. So let's have a look at this. If I take the US firms and I divide them into those that report being positively affected and those that report being negatively affected, first as a sanity check, you can see that it corresponds to the profit margin. Those that are positively affected report an increase in profit margins. Those that are negatively affected report a decrease in profit margin. But then focus on the other side. Start with the input price. The firms that are negatively affected are much more likely to report that as a consequence of the tariff, they're facing higher input prices. Okay, so think of a world in which the foreigners are not cutting their prices at all. You're not successfully manipulating the terms of trade. You face, as an importer, the old price plus the ad valorem tax, the tariff. And so you're facing a higher input price. If you look at the sales price, what you sell at, they are reporting that they're passing on some of this, that as a consequence, they're increasing their own sales price. But you can see that the difference between the firms that are positively affected and the firms that are negatively affected is much more mooted when it comes to increasing their own prices. So what is going on is the following. Imagine that I have a steel mill in the US that doesn't import steel from abroad or from Mexico. The US puts very high tariff on imported steel. That steel mill is going to report in the data that they're positively affected by the tariff because their competitors are facing higher input prices because they were sourcing from abroad. Their competitors are passing on some of those prices to the consumer by increasing the price of steel. This steel mill now has an option. It can either grab market share by maintaining lower prices, so multiply the markup by bigger quantities, profits go up, or it can increase prices and increase the markup because it doesn't face a higher input cost. That's a domestic producer subsidy of the tariff. And so you can see it here. Now, the only ones that we found domestic investment responses where they were planning to increase domestic investment was coming from the positively affected firm. So you can imagine doing, here I'm only going to do a few, but you can imagine doing this systematically for every firm around the world for different policy instruments. So this is, for us, is an ongoing project, but it's part of getting at some of the same mechanism, but in a very different way, and figuring out other ways to test the theory that isn't just the hard data. It has lots of other issues, so let me mention a few. There are advantages and disadvantages. What are pretty obvious ones? Well, first, a lot of this isn't quantitative. I'm planning to increase the prices, yeah, but by how much? Very often we're interested in a more precise assessment of, okay, you're passing on some of the higher input prices, but is the pass-through 5%, 90%? That's pretty different. In general, we find that that isn't great in this setup, or at least not primarily because of a limitation of AI in the quality of being able to extract the information from the text, but just because the text itself tends to not to be that quantitative. When CEOs speak, they tend to speak in, we plan to increase prices. Maybe they might qualify a lot, little, slow, fast, but they don't tend to speak like an economist that says, with a pass-through of 0.7. That doesn't tend to happen. And so that's one limitation. The other limitation, which I think this is not a class in econometrics, and I'm not going to have time to do it justice, but it should be very interesting to you, both if you want to pursue applied econometrics as a field, but also if you're just going to be a user like me, you have to think hard about the noise and the bias in the data. This has always been there. Like I wrote a paper with surveys 10 years ago, and human surveys felt like this. There is just a lot of good information in there, and there's a lot of noise and bias, and unfortunately, it is unlikely that it's classic measurement error. If it's classic measurement error, there's plenty of well-known techniques to deal with it. But this is not entirely likely. In fact, I would say it's probably pretty unlikely. And when you look at the noise in this data, it's not the level of noise that you put a footnote early in the paper and say, well, all large data sets have some noise, I'm going to ignore it. This is substantial. So there is many different ways to deal with it, and it's an open question right now. There are structural techniques where you try to characterize the bias and correct. It's not easy. There are more informal techniques of run these 50 different ways with different models, just get a sense of whether the results are reliable. They have the disadvantage that it's like doing robustness checks in papers. How much did you push it? It's a pretty soft sense. There isn't a pre-canned notion of did you explore it extensively enough, nor any guarantee that the particular variations that you did are enough. Maybe it breaks in other ways. And particularly with AI, that's important because one of the things that I'm sure has become obvious to you is that the way these models work doesn't have a lot of human generalizability. Like if you're a PhD student at Stanford and you pass Darrell Duffy's class, you tend to pass mine. We're pretty sure. If you tend to be very good at doing some super high level stuff, you're pretty good at doing other things. We tend to be able to predict that. AI is not like that. You might be great at a particular activity and then fail on trivial dimensions. And that we've seen all the time. I can give you a couple of good examples. One that occurred to us was very early. We were comparing this graph. Actually, a simpler version of here. This one. Fraction of firms that report being affected by tariffs. And Jesse, my co-author, who has written with Tarek before, had done a very simple, let me do it with bigrams and see if we can get a similar result. And we were finding that there were many more flags in bigrams. And so we thought, oh, we must have a mistake, AI isn't working. What had actually happened is that AI had idiot-proofed the two of us because we had given it a precise definition. We had said a tariff is a tax on import imposed by a government. I can't believe this because I'm Italian, so I should know. But what is a very common use of the word tariffa? If you're a Latin-speaking country, a tariffa is a fee schedule. Mobile phones, Netflix, they all talk about tariffs because they're talking about the fee schedule to customers. So if I simply look for number of firms mentioning tariffs, I would find many, many more, and they were all utility companies. AI had figured out that that use of the word tariff isn't a tax on imports, and had excluded them. Instead, when we were simply doing bigrams, a bigram, as I mentioned, the word tariff, that's it. So that's a great example of this was substantially more sophisticated than even the two authors were and sort of figured it out. On the other hand, he failed spectacularly in dimensions that you wouldn't expect. For example, I played around with increasing and decreasing sanctions. But the precise wording that people use in documents for the word increasing a sanction, it's hard to pick up. And it just struggles. Or it might struggle with export controls versus impediments to exports that come from climate legislation or consumer safety. There's ways in which he fails that are hard to predict given how good he does in other things. So it's just a good topic, but particularly here at Stanford, I hope you're experimenting with this. And the ability as a student to generate your own data for papers, it's a pretty incredible opportunity. This is going to change the field. I mean, I remember, look, Schiller was doing surveys by paper in the 1980s in finance. That's why he has a Nobel Prize. By the 2010s, the technology to do surveys on humans online had scaled up enormously. And you could do them. Like, Stephanie, for example, Stancheva, has done amazing work on this with the change in technology. The ability to use AI as a classifier and generate data out of unstructured video, text, it's just enormous. And as a student, it's just a great area. But he has to, he comes with his own baggage and things that you need to understand. And we're at the beginning of that process. But I hope you get involved. I find it tremendously interesting. Okay, so actually this data, we did put it online. So if you're interested in playing around with research on tariffs, export controls, and sanctions, all of the data is online, and we're going to keep putting it online. Again, the last thing I will mention is the cost of doing this kind of research is going to keep varying a lot. When we started, this was very expensive. It's already come down tremendously. Probably not close to a PhD student budget, but actually pretty affordable. But one of the things that I'm keen on, particularly here at Stanford, is to facilitate your work on this. So there's lots of limitations that come from proprietary data, servers that you cannot have access to, but there's a lot that you do. For example, a lot of text is routinely available. It's public. The congressional record, you can download it. Earning calls, they're on commercial data sets that are pretty access to you. The APIs, the server cost is becoming much more routine. So don't get discouraged from everything looks like I need to be, Anthropic to do it. A lot of this can be done on your laptop, being smart, and just thinking about good questions and good ways to implement it. So if you're interested, please come and speak to me, to other people here. There's lots of people that are interested, but it really, I want to encourage you not to think of it as off limits, to think of it instead as exactly what you should be doing if you're interested, and to jump on it. Okay, let me stop here. So, look, I just cannot think of a question of this size at least during my career, this is one of the most exciting things I've done. It just feels like it's a topic that no matter what, this is going to shape the next 20 years of economics, like the competition between the US and China, how we're going to rearrange the world order. This is going to be pretty consequential. And it's one where there's just a ton of good economics to do. A lot of it is, using basic good tools of macro, trade, political economy, the data. This is just the beginning. Like, there's going to be a whole wave of papers and agenda in this area. And so today I wanted to give you a sense of the research that I'm doing. A lot of the class has been things that are, the classics. This for me is what I do every day, all day. And so if you're interested, come and speak to me, or go speak to Steve. There's lots of good people. Go to Hoover. There's lots of interesting people there. Around campus, there are just a lot of people that are interested in these issues and are very good. And hopefully you get excited and you want to contribute. Things that I'm working on, we're working on a paper with multiple hegemons. Everything I've done today, it's just one hegemon at a time, but clearly in the world, right now there are two. In the past, there have been two or more. How does that change the game? We're thinking about political economy. One of the things that I'm very interested in is the relationship between the conflicts within the firms and his own government. Hidden in what I discussed today, you could see the conflict. Think of, for example, NVIDIA in that model. What NVIDIA would like to do is sell to everybody, restrict quantities, and increase the markup. Just a monopolist. What the US would like to do is have NVIDIA sell cheap to everybody but exclude China. So there's a clear conflict between the national security value of the firm and the value to the shareholders. And how does that lead to lobbying? Similarly, I get asked a lot, particularly on policy panels, whether the domestic political economy of the country matters. There is the sense out there that China has a big advantage in playing this game because it can directly dictate to state-owned enterprises what to do. Okay, so in the formal context of the model, you might think that I assume that the hegemon had no limits on what he could ask domestically of the firm. There might be participation constraints there too. And there might be differences in the political system. But then you also have to think about the opposite, which is the incentives to innovate might depend on whether or not the government is going to commandeer you later. And so whether or not you have a sector that is a choke point, that is technologically very advanced, might depend on commitment not to overuse it. If we tell Silicon Valley that every time they're going to have a great discovery, the US will commandeer it in the interest of national security, we can all agree that the incentives to innovate are going to go down a ton. So there's a lot there that hasn't been done. There's a lot with the duality with the military. Here, I intentionally, like if you think of political science, Joseph Nye had this thing of like soft power, like the ability to convince people that you're doing the right thing. Or, they all like California because they grew up watching Baywatch. That kind of thing, like Hollywood. Then you have like economic power, that's what we explore. But then there's like real hard power, like military threats, military intervention, all the way to like nuclear. We focus on this area, not because I felt that the other two are not interesting, but more because that's what we had something to say. And you focus on your own marginal product. But there's a lot of interesting stuff there. What are other things that are interesting? Today I did a little bit of finance, but it was really basic finance, like payment system. But there is lots of interesting stuff. I mentioned at the beginning buying firms abroad. Think about the model. The Lagrange multipliers on those participation constraints tell you the marginal value of having more power on that entity. That's your shopping list. I think of FDI as another way to get power. Rather than doing this whole game of inducing you to do what I want, I can just buy your equity. If I buy your equity and I own you, I'll dictate the answers. I'll just get you to do. If I want ASML not to sell to China, I can bully the Netherlands government and ASML and get them not to sell, or I can just buy the firm outright, and once I own it, I can decide not to sell. So that's a very different model of FDI. And where do you want to buy? There's things like causal evidence. Clearly most threats are endogenous, but can we have clean evidence that indeed, when I cut you off, this is the outcome? Right now, we're doing it to a structural model. We're inferring from the model that that's what happened, but can we do it with reduced form methods. And then we discussed, ultimately these have to be quantity question. I like your question of, a lot of stuff is not going to work. A lot of stuff isn't strategic. A lot of stuff isn't that important. But we have to show reliable sort of models to tell the government when industries come and lobby for, you should subsidize me because I'm very important for the national interest. We should have, as economists, an answer that says, actually, no, like we're pretty confident that you're plain vanilla. Or similarly, I think 98% of maybe of what the trade that we do, it's totally not sensitive, and then we shouldn't worry about it for national security, but we need to have better statements. And right now, we're not there. So hopefully this gives you a sense of where you could get involved. Let me stop here. I promise you there was a long reading list, so I wasn't kidding. It's here. You can read it at your own pleasure during the summer.